This is College Football with Sam. Welcome back, everyone. And today, on a Tuesday in the afternoon, I want to discuss some of the first round college football playoff matchups. Not give a prediction of mine. I want to spend some more time looking at the matchups and familiarizing myself with these teams. But I do want to give some early previews for these games, specifically for Ohio State versus Tennessee, Penn State versus SMU, Notre Dame versus Indiana. I also want to talk about a few other things as well. I think that there are several Big Ten teams who failed to reach the college football playoff or even come close this season that next year can take big steps forward and be college football playoff contenders. Some of them may even be national championship contenders, but I really want to talk about just from a can you make the college football playoff standpoint, which teams that didn't make it this year in the Big Ten could make it next season. And also for a little non-Big Ten conversation, I do want to talk about something that's going on in the ACC. And the fact that I think that with all the dysfunction in that conference and how, as you could clearly see from Clemson versus SMU, that it's a mess. It's a dysfunctional mess. Miami is the best team in that conference, but they lost two conference games late in the season, so they did not deserve to be in the college football playoff by the criteria the committee has given. All that being said, I think that if North Carolina chooses to invest heavily into their football program and they end up hiring Bill Belichick, that could do a lot for their program. And because of how weak the ACC is, Clemson's recruiting class right now for 2025 is garbage. Miami has a coach that has two left feet in Mario Cristobal. I think that we honestly could see a new balance of power. Also keep in mind that Fran Brown at Syracuse has been a complete success, and I think that he is a high-level head coach, someone I'm very high on, like the hiring in the preseason, and they're a top 25 team right now. Before we resume this live show and we begin to dive into these topics specifically one by one, starting with my early previews of these first-round playoff games, if you could like the show and if you could subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, I would appreciate that a lot. So just do those things. It's free, takes little to no time. Hit the like button, share this channel around to others who like the sport, who love it, who are passionate about it. Subscribe and also hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when new content drops. If you do decide to super chat, thank you for the support. I will answer your super chat in a question and answer session where I will also be answering questions live on Friday. It'll just be a session where you can ask me anything. I'll answer prior super chats in that show, and we'll just talk some college football there. That will be taking place Friday, delayed because I have an exam that is taking place tomorrow that I need to study for, and that is very, very important to me. I am still in college, believe it or not. Attending the University of Michigan, by the way, for those of you who did not know. If you want to support the channel in a different way, you can check out my Patreon page and sign up as a member via the link in the description. You can also purchase merchandise via my merchandise store, like wearing this nice black College Football with Sam hoodie. You can find that on my merchandise store and purchase that, which is in the description. So thank you for all of your support, for your following, and let's get down to business here and start with some brief early previews, just looking at things from a bird's eye view, looking at matchups. I'm not giving you a prediction. I will probably indicate who I might favor, but that doesn't mean a prediction is final, and I'm going to try to not do that because, after all, this is an early preview. The Indiana Hoosiers make their first ever college football playoff appearance after winning 11 games for the first time in school history, in the regular season, nonetheless. And they are traveling to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, who are favored by 7.5 points. This game is taking place Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and Notre Dame is also 11-1. Notre Dame suffered a loss to Northern Illinois, and at that point, I thought their season was basically over. Many thought their season was over. Ever since then, they have rattled off 10 straight wins. They are number one in the country in points per play margin, points per play. They're one of college football's most dominant teams, if not the most dominant team in all of college football right now. And this matchup is intriguing because it's an in-state matchup. They're both in the state of Indiana. Both have played relatively weak strengths of schedule, or relatively weak schedules, rather. Strengths of schedule, that's an intriguing term. So I wonder who's going to step up in this game. I wonder what's the key matchup here. And I think that when I look at two teams who are very dominant and who have played, again, weak schedules, who's going to come out on top? Who is going to... Who's going to show up, and who is more battle-tested? I think who's battle-tested more is a key point to follow in this game. So the Indiana Hoosiers travel to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Notre Dame's favored by 7.5 points. And I think that whichever team is more battle-tested, and that is to be seen, is going to step up and win this football game. Again, the Irish are favored by 7.5 points. The game takes place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Friday, December 20th. It's in South Bend. Tickets are already priced at over $1,000. The stadium is sold out, I do believe. Both teams are top 10 in football power. Both are highly rated analytically. Notre Dame and Indiana are both very dominant. They have very efficient offenses, very efficient defenses. I'm excited for this game. You also have two head coaches who are relatively new to the gig, to their gig, to being a head coach at a Power 4 program in college football. I mean, Marcus Freeman is in year 3 as a head coach. Not just as the head coach at Notre Dame, year 3 as a head coach, period. Notre Dame's his first ever head coaching job. Curt Cignetti, bless me, that's a bad sneeze. Curt Cignetti has been at Indiana for only 1 year. This is his first year, very successful season. And he's been a head coach before, James Madison and Elon, but this is his first job in the Power 4. And overall, Notre Dame losing to NIU, bad loss, but won the other 11 games on their schedule. Indiana, bad loss at Ohio State, made a lot of mistakes in that game, but won the other 11 games on their schedule. Both of these teams overall have had success, and I think have been well coached, have played to their strengths, have been fundamentally sound, and they have done their best to negate their weaknesses. I want to talk about their weaknesses, but first talk about some of the strengths of these teams to really get into the matchup that's going to be taking place here. For Indiana, and I've discussed this before, their non-negotiable throughout the season has clearly been their defensive line. It's been their defensive tackles, C.J. West, James Carpenter, Tyreek Tucker, their defensive ends, especially Michael Kamara, but also Linnell Carr Jr., and ultimately a rushing defense that is one of the best in the entire country. Indiana's rushing defense this season, let me give you some numbers to show how dominant it is. Second in opponent yards per carry, allowing 2.6. Second in opponent rushing first downs per game, allowing 5.3. First in opponent rushing yards per game, allowing 76.2. Fifth in opponent rushing attempts per game, allowing 29.1. Teams do not like to run the football on Indiana because teams have learned that they can't. They can't do it. Ohio State couldn't do it. Granted, they had a very dinged-up offensive line, but even as the game progressed and Indiana was getting worn down, Ohio State couldn't run the football. Purdue couldn't run the football. Michigan State couldn't. Michigan couldn't. Nebraska could not. Outside of a long run or two by Jonah Coleman, Washington could not. And Indiana has not played a strong schedule, especially in regards to rushing offenses. But nonetheless, when you look at relative performance and you look at numbers like I've just presented to you that are this strong, it's something to take notice of, really. And their linebackers are good. Their defense is good. It's so interesting looking at these two defenses who are both highly ranked. Indiana is better in basically everything compared to Notre Dame in terms of total defense and rushing defense. And then in passing defense and scoring defense, Notre Dame is basically better at everything compared to Indiana. So it's interesting looking at these different statistical categories and seeing how dominant they are overall, but also how dominant they are compared to each other in certain categories. Indiana is third in opponent yards per play, allowing only 4.1. Notre Dame's fifth, allowing 4.4. In scoring defense, Indiana allows 15.7 points per game. Notre Dame allows 13.6. Indiana only allows 0.252 points per play. Notre Dame allows 0.2 points per play. Sixth and third for both of these teams, respectively. For Notre Dame, their key strength, they have a good defense. They do. In the same way that Indiana has a good offense. In fact, the numbers would suggest they're near elite to elite in those categories that I mentioned. For Notre Dame, their defense, and Indiana, their offense. But I think Notre Dame's biggest non-negotiable here is their rushing offense. Their defense has not played a lot of high-functioning offenses. I mean, A&M, one of their best wins of the year, came when the Aggies arguably were at their worst, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. They started Connor Weigman. As the year evolved, it was clear that Marcel Reed was the better quarterback and better fit for their system. And it was, game one with a new staff and new transfers. NIU doesn't exactly have a good offense. USC's offense has been its worst under Lincoln Riley, and Lincoln Riley had his worst offense of his career with this USC team. Georgia Tech didn't have Haynes King, and service academies are service academies. They're very limited. The constant, and something that I love from Notre Dame, is their rushing offense, because like Indiana, and Indiana's rushing defense, no matter how weak the strength of schedule, what they are doing is impressive, and it is to be paid respect to and paid attention to. That is Notre Dame's rushing offense. Notre Dame averages 0.622 points per play, which is first, and that's insane. Their points per play margin is 0.422, which is first. Indiana is second in points per play, allowing 0.598, and third in points per play margin, averaging 0.346. Notre Dame is third in points per game. They are third in offensive touchdowns per game, and a huge part of the reason why is they are second in yards per carry, averaging 6.3. That's insane. And averaging 224.8 rushing yards per game, which is 11th. And they do that while only averaging 35.7 rushing attempts per game, which is 75th. Now, their passing offense is something that we will talk about in a few seconds because it's a weakness, but their offensive line is incredible. And their running back room with Jadarian Price and, more importantly, with Jeremiah Love is something that I am impressed by. Jeremiah Love is an All-American caliber running back, and Billy Scruth, Pat Coogan, Rocco Spindler, Emil Wagner, and all those players on the offensive line, they're high level. Joe Rudolph has done a great job coaching and developing that offensive line, and Mike Denbrock has done an excellent job, I think, in adapting his scheme to Notre Dame's personnel. Those are the strengths of these teams. Their weaknesses, I think for Indiana, it's their interior offensive line, it's their special teams, and collectively, it's their pass block. Ever since Indiana has suffered some injuries on the offensive line, and more importantly, when they played against high-level talent on the D-line or on defense, Michigan and then Ohio State, they have struggled in pass protection. They have struggled mightily. The injury to Drew Evans at guard resulted in Tyler Steffens stepping up and taking that left guard spot, and he has been the weak link on that offensive line ever since. Carter Smith is a beast, I think. Mike Caddick is solid too. Bray Lynch and Trey Wettig are good as well, but Steffens provides a little bit of a hole for opposing defenses, and this offensive line, even before the injury, was not elite exactly in pass protection, giving up some sacks to Maryland and inferior opponents early in the year. That's a weakness for Indiana. And their special teams started off solid, started off strong, but ever since the month of November, their special teams has slowly been declining, and at times, like against Ohio State, teetering on the brink of disaster. Indiana gives up 1.6 sacks per game, which is 46th, and they have a 5.56 quarterback sack percentage, which is 53rd. It's not like Notre Dame's elite at pass protection. They're not Oregon. Notre Dame gives up 1.3 sacks per game and a 4.4% quarterback sack percentage, which is 33rd. But still, they're better than Indiana in that category. And as for special teams, punting has been an issue, like against the Ohio State game. And you look at, the interior of the offensive line, that also affects Indiana's rushing offense, which I think is strong, really at gaining short yardage, and their running backs are not exactly built to be speed and space running backs, but nonetheless, they're only averaging 4.2 yards per carry, and that is 72nd nationally. So those are some areas that I look at Indiana and ultimately have some concerns with. Interior offensive line, the pass block, the depth overall, which is something that I've talked about before, how Indiana does not have a lot of blue chip talent and consequentially elite depth everywhere. Notre Dame, talent-wise, is better off, but still not far better off because their wide receiver and tight end rooms are very, very limited. I mean, I said on Twitter that this team is kind of a reincarnation of 2022 Michigan. And it is, in a lot of ways. They have talent everywhere. They're talented everywhere. There is no place where Notre Dame lacks talent. But there are places where you question if the talent is being utilized properly, if you question whether there's talent there, but is it ever going to break through? I look at their receiver room, for example. Their leading receiver has barely over 400 receiving yards. It's Bo Collins, their wide receiver, with 427 receiving yards. Jaden Greathouse is 345. Mitchell Evans, and a preseason All-American tight end in my mind, are very close to it, only has 272, and he's averaging 9.4 yards per reception. Riley Leonard barely has a 140.8 passer rating. He's completing 66% of his throws, averaging 7.1 yards per pass attempt. His QBR is 15th, 16 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He's a good quarterback, but elite, I don't necessarily think so. And consequentially, with some of the weakness at wide receiver, at tight end, and also Riley Leonard being, not a Heisman caliber quarterback, you get a passing offense that is a little bit questionable there. Whereas Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, and that offensive line are all elite and can punish really anyone who faces against them. Bo Collins, Jaden Greathouse, Jordan Faison, and Mitchell Evans, and Riley Leonard, at least Leonard's arm, his legs are absolutely incredible. He has several hundred rushing yards. They sort of play off of the rushing offense. And that's good as long as the rushing offense is successful. But circle back to, much like Indiana, a weaker strength of schedule, you wonder that if either of these teams, if their weaknesses can get exploited and their strengths are limited, whether it's this game or maybe a future game, depending on who wins, you wonder how they'll be able to adapt to that. Like Indiana could not adapt to Ohio State's pass rush. They failed. They couldn't do it. And when they finally did, the game was already over, and there was clearly a change of pace for Ohio State. For Notre Dame, we have seen that if you can patiently run the ball on them, because their rushing defense is a little bit shaky, just a little bit, and if you can really limit their passing offense along with keeping a lid on top of their rushing offense, that was the strategy Northern Illinois used. Controlled the clock, kept running the ball, had one big play, just one. It was a fluke pass that went for nearly 90 yards to the house for a touchdown. You can beat them. So the critical matchup, the most important one, the one where I'm fascinated to see how adjustments are made here throughout the game, and one that I think involves the most coaching, is Indiana's pass protection, their running backs, their offensive linemen protecting quarterback Curtis Rourke, and how Their offensive coordinator, Tino Sansuri, is going to manage that, is going to scheme that against Al Golden's defense, and specifically his defensive front, the defensive line group and the linebacker group. Notre Dame on the year has 30 sacks, and they have players up front like R.J. Oben, Howard Cross III, Riley Mills, Joshua Burnham, and they have some depth there, and they have some serious players. And then Jack Kaiser, who's a veteran, Drake Bowen, a younger, talented player. How does their front operate against Carter Smith, Tyler Steffens, Mike Caddick, Bray Lynch, and Trey Weddig on the line, Zach Horton, Indiana's tight end, and whatever running back Indiana has, whether it's Ellison, Lawton, Black, in pass protection? And does Curtis Rourke use his legs a little bit more? You know, Curtis Rourke ran an option offense at Ohio, and I was surprised that his legs weren't used more against Ohio State. They were used a little bit later, and that helped Indiana get down the field and score their garbage time touchdown. So do they use that in this game? I think they should, but we'll have to see. If I were Notre Dame, I would be attacking that offensive line fairly early and sending pressure, timing up blitzes, and seeing if they can handle it. And, you know, if you get burned for a play or they drive down the field, well, you adapt. This is the college football playoffs. It's not time to play scared, and that goes for both sides. This is a game to be aggressive. This is a game to play to your potential and not play down to your opponent. Another critical matchup here, one that I think is more strength on strength. Of course, coaching is involved in everything, but is Indiana's rushing defense against Notre Dame's rushing offense, because Notre Dame has just ran through everyone all season long, and no one has ran on Indiana or through them. This is the unstoppable force against the immovable object, is Indiana's rushing defense, specifically their defensive line, which is a non-negotiable, against Notre Dame's non-negotiable of their offensive line and running back room. Whoever wins this wins the game. And I think that's the case even if, let's say, for Indiana, they can't protect Curtis Rourke at all, and they just give up sack after sack after sack, and maybe they only get a few consistent drives. If Notre Dame can't run the football with Indiana's passing defense, well, then it just becomes a very low-scoring game, and any advantage that Notre Dame has over Indiana in terms of pass rush and pass protection is sort of negated there. You could also say that if Indiana is able to move down the football, they protect Curtis Rourke, and they're scoring a lot on this Notre Dame defense. If they can't stop Notre Dame's run, well, Notre Dame can probably dictate the pace of the game, and even if it's a shootout, or if it looks like it's going to be a shootout, they can slow it down. Or if it is a shootout and out of control, well, as long as they time everything right, they can make sure that they're the last team that scores, and therefore the team that wins. So that is a fascinating matchup. Indiana's rushing defense, their defensive line, against Notre Dame's rushing offense, their offensive line and running back room, and also Notre Dame's defensive front, specifically in pass rush, against Indiana's offensive line, their tight ends, their running backs, their pass blockers, and if Curtis Rourke can maybe use his mobility more to negate some of Notre Dame's pass rush, and how comfortable he is in the pocket. Is he seeing ghosts a bit after that Ohio State game when Notre Dame sends blitzes? Is he calm? Does he step up in the pocket? Does he maybe scramble a bit? We'll have to see, but I'm excited for this game, as I am for all the college football playoff games, but especially with this one, it being just a 7.5-point spread. My eyes will be glued to the TV screen, and these are two programs who, again, they've played weaker schedules, but these are also some of the more statistically dominant teams in the country. Power ratings factor in strength of schedule, and both of these teams are still top 10. In fact, Notre Dame is easily top 5 according to most power ratings. So go Fighting Irish and go Hoosiers. I'm excited to see this one live. So that's that right there for the Hoosiers and also for the Irish. Let me read some chats here. We got some concurrent viewers here, some people talking. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. What's up, Toasty? Says, what's up, Sam? Give me Tennessee, Penn State, Clemson, and Notre Dame. Wow, I actually have some, well, there are some disagreements there, but you won't know that until we talk about my actual predictions for these games. Someone says, hope Coach Cigarette wins. Emmett Johnson's coming back to Lincoln, Nebraska. Yeah, I'll talk about that probably later this week. Notre Dame's line seems bad. More like pick'em. I would have 3 to 3.5 for home field advantage. Yeah, I think that Notre Dame's defensive line is an area, more so for run block, that is a little bit questionable. But you also have to keep in mind that Indiana, in their only big game of the year, did look very limited. And Notre Dame is at home, and they're the more talented team as well. Notre Dame is closer to Ohio State in talent than they are to Indiana. And I think that people are picking up on the fact, like, okay, this is the second most talented team overall, outside of maybe Michigan, but Michigan is not as good as Notre Dame. That's very clear that Indiana's played all season long. And everyone that is talented, that has a roster made up of half or more blue chip players, Indiana has either barely pulled away from or gotten blown out by Michigan and Ohio State, respectively. So I think that's definitely factored in. Indiana, though, they definitely have some advantages here, just like Notre Dame does. I think this is going to be a close and competitive game. That is all I will say. Other people are talking about how Indiana will either win or Notre Dame will win. Yeah, it's going to be a competitive game. This will be a hotly contested game. I think the committee, one of the few good decisions they made was making this the Friday game, like giving it its own slot, because I do think that this, along with Ohio State, Tennessee, is the most intriguing matchup that we have for sure. But before we get to that, I kind of want to go in the order of these games in terms of time slots, and we'll talk about Saturday's game at noon. The SMU Mustangs, the ACC runner-ups, travel to the Penn State Nittany Lions, who are 9-point favorites. And this game will take place on Saturday, December 21st at noon Eastern Time. Penn State, by the way, has declared this game as a whiteout, so yes, it will kick off at noon. But I have no doubt, with it being a home playoff game and Penn State fans and faithful knowing all that is on the line, that it will be loud, it will be rambunctious, and it will have a whiteout feel. What I'm interested to see in this game is how the weather affects SMU, how these rushing offenses and defenses perform against each other, and how these two coaches, who are offensive-minded in James Franklin and Rhett Lashley, perform in a big spot. SMU has had a weak strength of schedule all season long. Penn State has a tougher schedule that they have faced, of course, but still, they're 0-2 against the only teams they've played all year that are inside of the top 10. More specifically, I would say the top 5. I think Ohio State is a top 5 team. I think Oregon right now is the best team in all of college football. They're 0-2 against those teams. SMU, well, they lost to BYU and they lost to Clemson. And those are the best teams that they have played all season long. So who wins the big game here? And a huge part of that is going to take place in the trenches, where both of these teams have strengths on their offensive lines and defensive lines, and both have good running backs. So let's really dive in here and talk about the strengths for both of these teams. For SMU, it's their rush defense, which has been impressive for much of the year, and their defensive line to go on top of that. When you look at the Mustangs and what they have done, a huge part of the reason why they are winning games is because of their defense. Their offense has been performing at a high level, by the way. They're top 10 in scoring offense, scoring 36.8 points per game. They are scoring 0.524 points per play, but their points per play margin is not too far behind. It's 11th with a 0.23 points per play margin. That's because their defense has been strong. Is it elite? No, but they're 28th in opponent points per game, allowing only 22. They're 17th in opponent points per play, allowing 0.295. They only allow on the year 3.3 red zone scoring attempts per game, which is 63rd. But they're 13th in opponent red zone scoring percentage, only allowing opponents to score 75% of the time in the red zone, so 3 out of every 4 trips inside of the red zone. And a huge part of that is they limit you to short plays only allow opponents to average 4.6 yards per play, which is 10th, only slightly behind Penn State's defense, who allows opponents to average 4.5 yards per play, 8th. And they're third in opponent yards per carry, only allowing opponents to average 2.8 yards on the ground. And you don't even have to adjust that for sacks all that much because they only have a 7.72 defensive sack percentage, which is 31st. They only allow 98.3 rushing yards per game, which is 8th, 5.9 rushing first downs per game, which is 8th. And opponents like to run the ball on SMU. They average 34.8 rushing attempts. SMU's opponents do per game, which is 53rd. And SMU's defense does have a problem with opponent plays per game. Opponents average 74.7 plays per game on SMU, which is 125th, and yet they put up these numbers. It's literally the definition of bend but don't break defense. But what helps is they're strong on the defensive line. They limit you in running the football, and they're strong and they're physical up there on the defensive front. SMU is a very impressive team. It was a hard decision between them and Alabama as to who would get in the playoff. I thought that a team like South Carolina, for example, deserved to get in more than Alabama because South Carolina did have better losses and they looked better at the end of the season. But the college football playoff system is broken, and I think at the end of the day, SMU did better with their schedule than a team like Alabama did. And I'm not, this video obviously isn't me discussing playoff scenarios or what should be. I'm just kind of making arguments for both. SMU does not have a very good resume, that's for sure. They've played a very weak schedule. Other teams who were left out played harder schedules. But SMU also lost to a 10-win BYU and a 10-win Clemson team, who is a champion and is talented. So, looking at the Mustangs, Elijah Roberts, Anthony Booker Jr., Jared Harrison-Hunte, and Jafari Harvey. Those are players to look out for on the defensive line. You look at Penn State, their strength is tight end with Tyler Warren, and I would say beyond that, the defensive line and the offensive line as well. But I just really wanted to mention the defensive line because I think Penn State's defensive line is very talented, especially in run defense, but also in getting to the quarterback with Abdul Carter and then Zane Durant, Denai Dennis Sutton. You look at Devon J. Thomas and some of the backups too at the defensive tackle room like Alonzo Ford Jr., Keziah Izzard, Amin Vanover at defensive end. They're very deep on the defensive line, and they're very talented up front as well. Penn State this season, they only allow in opponents running the football 3.3 yards per carry, 13th, 103.8 rushing yards per game, 11th. Opponents run the ball for about 31.9 attempts per game on Penn State, which is 19th. And Penn State allows opponents to gain 7.1 rushing first downs per game, 27th. Penn State, they do a good job of getting interior pressure. They let their presence get known on the defensive line, where they just feast with tackles for loss, do a good job of getting sacks. And you look at their defensive line, or their offensive line rather, they're averaging 5.3 yards per carry, which is 15th, 202 rushing yards per game, which is 16th. They like to run the football. They love to be physical. This is a physical team in Penn State. Their rushing offense, I think, is a huge strength of theirs. I think it's stronger than their rush defense, or pass offense. So Penn State really has a lot of key strengths everywhere. Positionally, it's tight end with Tyler Warren, who has over 1,000 all-purpose yards and over 10 total touchdowns. As a unit, their defensive line, I think, is one of the strongest units in the country and on their roster, but their functionality in rushing offense is special, and we've seen that in games where maybe they're facing adversity in other areas, but their rushing offense is staying consistent, or like against Oregon, where at one point they were averaging close to 10 yards per carry and were just 3 or 4 yards short of 300 rushing yards. Their weaknesses for these teams, for SMU, it's their offensive line, it's their cornerback room, and overall their rushing offense. Now, SMU's offensive line, I think, nationally is still a good unit. Savion Bard, Logan Parr, Ja'Kai Clark, Justin Osborne, PJ Williams. They do make up a good starting group on the offensive line, and they do have some depth and experience there. SMU is a talented team, and Brashard Smith is a great running back, and Kevin Jennings, I think, is a good quarterback. This is a good offense, but you look at their rushing offense this season, and they are only averaging 4.2 yards per carry, 70th, 160 rushing yards per game, 69th, and they're, trying to run the football, 37.7 average rushing attempts per game, and it's just not consistently working. Their offensive line does a good job in protecting the QB. They only allow a 3.84 sack percentage, which is 23rd, and 1.3 sacks per game, which is also 23rd. So the offensive line isn't bad. It's just a weakness on the team. And then you look at corner, and it's a similar story. SMU in defending the pass is respectable. They're respected, but they're not great. They allow 6.6 opponent yards per pass attempt, 34th, and 11.5 opponent yards per completion, which is 47th. Opponents complete 57.24% of their pass attempts, which is an area SMU's good in, but if you can complete the football, you will gain yards on these guys, and they're not exactly a fantastic in terms of sack percentage. They get a lot of sacks per game, 3.1 per game, but teams passing them for about 37 attempts per game. So once you factor in sacks per attempt, their sack rate is outside of the top 25. For Penn State, it's their wide receivers, and it's their special teams, and it's James Franklin. Penn State, you wouldn't know it exactly by their statistics, where the Nittany Lions this season have been averaging 8.8 yards per pass attempt, 9th, and 12.7 yards per completion, 39th. Their average team passer rating is top 10. Their passing yards per game is 41st, and their completion percentage is nearly 70%. But if you watch the games and you look at box scores and you observe what they've done in big games, you'll see that Harrison Walls III, Amari Evans, Julian Fleming, and Liam Clifford, they're good players, or at least average players. I think Harrison Walls III is even a great player, but they don't have a lot of depth there. It's a lot like SMU's cornerback room or offensive line, where it's good, but against better opponents, it can be a liability and something that can be taken out of the game. And you look at special teams for the Nittany Lions, their punting has been inconsistent this year. Their kicker, Ryan Barker, who was initially the second stringer, but they brought in after the original starter, struggled. He's been doing well, but he's not an elite kicker, and that combined with some of the struggles in the punting department have not been helpful. Penn State's average starting field position is pretty poor. And James Franklin is 1-14 against AP top 5 opponents. His last win against a top 5 team, and SMU's not a top 5 team by power ratings or rankings. Last win against a top 5 team was Ohio State in 2016. His last win against a top 10 team came against Utah in the Rose Bowl in the 2022 postseason. Before that, I don't know when it came. Before that, beat Utah, and then I think in another postseason bowl game he beat a top 10 team. I want to say maybe 2017 against Washington, 2019 against Memphis. Oh no, it was Wisconsin in 2016. It came to me. He struggles against top 10 competition, against teams that have close to his team's talent or similar or especially better, and teams that are well coached. I mean, James Franklin in big games is a liability. So those are things to pay attention to for both of these teams. I think that a critical matchup to pay attention to, one where I'm fascinated to see the battle and the dance of the coaches, is SMU's offensive coordinator and his quarterback, his offensive line, his tight end, and his wide receiver. How do they do in passing the football against Penn State's defense? This is a Penn State defense who is stronger at defending the run than defending the pass. The Oregon game was the epitome of that. And it's also an SMU offense who is much better at passing the football than running the football. So how is that going to work? You're on the road. You're facing Abdul Carter, Deni Dennis Sutton, great linebackers, a great defense overall, and you have some players in the passing game who can make plays, and you have an offensive line who can do an all right job, a good job at protecting you. So how does Casey Woods handle the environment? What plays does he call? How does he line up against a Tom Allen defense that has elite players, but as we have seen against the better teams, can be got? So how do Brashard Smith, the offensive line, SMU's quarterback Kevin Jennings, and Jordan Hudson, Jake Bailey, and Moochie Dixon, how do they match up against Penn State? And looking at, Abdul Carter, and then at linebacker, Tony Roas and Kobe King, and corner A.J. Harris, do they target Jalen Kimber, who's been somewhat of a liability in the secondary? How do Zakee Wheatley, Jalen Reed, and Cam Miller do at the safety and the lion positions for Penn State's defense? That's a matchup that I am fascinated by, is SMU's passing offense against this Penn State defense, because there probably isn't a world where SMU is doing a very good job at running the football but can't also pass the football. If SMU can't pass the football, Penn State could win in a shutout. If SMU can pass the football and do it rather well, that's where you're going to see opportunities for Brashard Smith consistently appear in the ground game. And that's where Penn State's biggest weakness is. To go back to SMU's passing offense, it's their passing defense. That's an area where they have some weaknesses and where they have some holes that I think they're going to look to fill in the 2025 preseason after this is all said and done, the college football playoff. Another matchup is SMU's defense, but really their rushing defense, against Penn State's downfield blockers and their running backs, Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, and whether it's Drew Aller, Bo Pribula, or Tyler Warren at the quarterback position. How does SMU do at containing this rushing offense, which is peaking right now? This offensive line stepped up after the injury to Anthony Dunco, who was previously their best run blocker. And Nick Dawkins, Olivega Ione, Drew Shelton, Sal Wormley, Anthony Dunco, J.B. Nelson, they have a deep, physical offensive line. Tyler Warren is a physical tight end, good blocker, good receiver, wildcat weapon. He's a Swiss Army knife. Aller is more mobile than he was last year. Pribula is extremely mobile. And Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen do have a burst element to them and a power element as well, to where if they have good blocking, they can be gone, and they can pick up huge chunk plays, and they don't give up. They persevere. But SMU's rushing defense, as we have seen, is physical. They will bully you, and they will impose their will on you. Elijah Roberts, Anthony Booker Jr., Jared Harrison Hunte, Jafari Harvey, Kobe Wilson, Ahmad Walker. They have good linebackers. They have a good defensive line. And Penn State's rushing offense, it's awesome. I'd say it's at minimum near elite, could be elite, but it's not quite Notre Dame's. And against Ohio State, they struggled mightily. And in some other games too, like against Minnesota, they were got on the ground. So this is another matchup where if Penn State can impose their will on the ground and run all over SMU, then even if SMU's offense has some success, can they really overcome that edge for Penn State, the home field advantage, the crowd always being in it? After all, they're 9-point underdogs. They're not double-digit underdogs, but they're 2-score underdogs per Vegas. And if SMU can shut down Penn State's rushing offense, then that can give their offense some time to figure out this Penn State defense and to quickly make adjustments, because Penn State's defense, it starts off games rough, typically. You look at the analytics here, and Penn State's first quarter defense is 50th. They allow 4.8 opponent first quarter points per game, and they allow 6.3 opponent second quarter points per game. They're outside the top 25 in both of those, but they're top 10 in opponent third quarter points per game and fourth quarter points per game. Penn State's defense gets better as the game goes on. So SMU's offense and Casey Woods, their offensive coordinator, they're always going to need to adapt and change things up and find new weaknesses. And if Penn State's rushing offense is high-flying and can do what it wants to do on the ground, well, SMU won't have the amount of drives and opportunities necessary to really push this defense and come out with a win. So those are the important matchups here. I'm excited to watch this game at noon. Not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday after that, December 20th. It's an exciting game. You got two teams who have not won a big game all season long, and this is their game to prove it. And then they have Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl in the next round, depending on who wins this matchup. So Penn State over SMU, who do you think is going to win? It's a fascinating thing to look at. SMU's like Oregon, PH Pop Enlock says. If Penn State loses, they need to fire James Franklin. I mean, I honestly think, yeah, if they lose to SMU at home, he should be on the hot seat. Literally watched every Notre Dame game yesterday. Love is really good. Yeah, Jeremiah Love is one of the nation's best running backs. I predict an all Big Ten championship. Georgia's QB is out, and Oregon/Ohio State will shut down Texas. And yeah, Penn State does have a easier path than others do, although they should not underestimate anyone. And you also got to think about Indiana. If Indiana beats Notre Dame, then who can't they beat? Because Notre Dame is viewed as that good analytically. They could be overrated due to their, schedule. But if they can beat Notre Dame, who's beating them outside of maybe Ohio State and Oregon because of how great their receivers are and how on time and consistent their passing offense can be? Who can beat them? So I think that's very reasonable. It's a very reasonable prediction. Obviously, I'm not going to reveal my bracket prediction. That's coming soon, though. Very soon in the next few days after my, to answer Lee Felix's question after my econ exam for the one class I'm taking this year while also doing this full time. Penn State in the trenches is too good to be losing to SMU. We'll see. I said the other day Penn State is the best trench play in the country, and they showed that, I think, against Oregon, but they did not show that at all against Ohio State. And that was even when Ohio State was down their left tackle, Josh Simmons, who's declared for the NFL. Good luck to him. And they weren't doing well the prior week against Nebraska. So we'll just have to see. But speaking of Oregon and Ohio State, we got to talk about the game before Oregon and Ohio State. And that game is Tennessee at Ohio State. So the Tennessee Volunteers travel north to face off against the Ohio State Buckeyes, who are 7.5-point favorites. This is the second night game of the first round, the other being Indiana at Notre Dame, which takes place on Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. This game takes place Saturday, December 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And the first thing that I got to think of in this game is, who does the cold weather benefit? Many people have talked about this on other channels. Many have. Does the cold weather benefit Ohio State because Tennessee isn't used to it? Or does it benefit Tennessee because their style of play is right now on offense more physical? And on defense, they're physical too. Ohio State is more impressive on defense, as we will discuss. But Tennessee is pretty close on the defensive side of the football to Ohio State. In fact, there may even be an argument that they're better on that side of the football. So that's one thing. But more importantly, because weather does play a role, but it's ultimately not the biggest role, is which offense steps up. Which offense oils up their machine, which, if the machine is well oiled, if it's taken care of, if it's filled to the brim with diesel or gasoline, whatever you want to use, they both can be some of the best offenses in the country. But all season long, especially as the year has gone on, especially in conference play, there have been notable issues and inconsistencies with both of these offenses. So whether it's Joey Hazel or Chip Kelly, I'm curious to see how these offensive coordinators do in this matchup, calling plays. And also for the players on offense, how do they perform? Because there have been some communication issues, whether it's Ohio State's offensive line or Tennessee's quarterback and wide receivers and the chemistry they have. This is an intriguing game, a very intriguing game, and it's projected by the spread, Ohio State being favored by 7.5 right now, to be one of the more entertaining college football playoff matchups in the first round. I want to talk about the strengths, the key strengths, some of them the non-negotiables for both of these teams, things that you have to face off against, where you can't just go around them, you have to go through them, and you got to figure out how you can go through them. For Tennessee, that's their running back room, and that's their defensive end group, and overall, it is a rush defense that's elite, if we got to be honest with ourselves here. You look at Tennessee's rushing defense, and on the season, their defense is only averaging 14.9 opponent points per game, which is fourth, 0.221 opponent points per play, which is fifth. They're only allowing 4.2 opponent yards per play, which is fourth, and 2.9 yards per carry, which is sixth. They're only allowing 6.9 opponent first down rushing attempts per game, which is 22nd, or first down rushes per game, like first downs that an opponent earns by running the football, and 101.9 rushing yards per game. And this is despite the fact that teams like to run on Tennessee. They love to. Teams run on Tennessee for an average of 35.2 attempts per game, which is 61st, and yet Tennessee is top 10 in the majority of rushing defense categories. It's an impressive unit, this Tennessee defense is. Tim Banks has done, I think, a phenomenal job this year with Tennessee, and it's helped them win a lot of games in spite of some of their clunkiness on the offensive side of the ball. A player that you got to look out for Tennessee is James Pierce Jr., their defensive end, who is projected in the preseason. I don't know about now because I don't often pay attention to NFL mock drafts, but James Pierce Jr. at one point was projected to be a high first-round player. He's very impressive, he is, with the Tennessee Volunteers. And Tennessee on the season has been a team that is defensively led. And against Georgia, there were some weaknesses shown, but their second loss to Arkansas was because of the offense. They were able to shut down Vanderbilt's offense, which is a very hard thing to do. There's a lot to be impressed by with this team, who sits at 10-2, top 10. They were the first team left out of the home college football playoff zone in the first round. If Tennessee and Ohio State switched rankings, it would be Tennessee hosting Ohio State. The Volunteers on the season have a pretty impressive pass rush where they have 29 sacks, and James Pierce Jr. is accounting for 7.5 of them. It's not the same quality of pass rush as, let's say, Ohio State when they're blitzing, or Oregon or Penn State when they send four and they scheme it well so they get home. Or I would even say the same thing about Texas. Pittsburgh's had a pretty good pass rush, but Tennessee's is good. It's great. And James Pierce Jr. by himself is a non-negotiable. And then you look at Dylan Sampson, where Tennessee this season is running the ball quite well. In fact, very well. On average, 5 yards per carry, 29th. They are fifth in rushing attempts per game, averaging 45.4, and they're averaging 226.2 rushing yards per game. They run the ball a lot. They don't have the same efficiency that Notre Dame or Penn State or even USC do on the ground, for context, but they run the ball a lot and they wear you down on the ground. They don't give up running the football. You look at Ohio State, their non-negotiable is their entire wide receiver room and their safeties. And their defense is elite. It's not just the rushing defense or the passing defense. It's both. Everything the defense does, except getting pressure by sending four, is elite. If they blitz, the blitzes are often timed up well, and the coverage guys are good enough to where you're going to have to run a brilliant scheme, or your receiver is going to have to be an X-factor player to negate that. That's most of the time. Sometimes we have seen where that doesn't work, but this Ohio State defense has been good in every game with the exception of the Oregon game. And after what Oregon did to Penn State, I wonder if Oregon's offense at its ceiling is just so good that no defense can shut it down. But Ohio State is first in opponent points per game, first in yards per point, first in opponent points per play, and they've played one of the nation's tougher schedules, so you know this defense is legit. They only allow 1.3 opponent red zone scores per game. First, They are first in opponent red zone scoring percentage, only allowing opponents to score in 55.17% of their red zone trips. And they are first in offensive touchdowns per game. They allow 10.9 opponent points per game and 0.178 opponent points per play. This is a dominant defense. It only allows 3.9 opponent yards per play and 241.5 yards per game. Opponents only average 2.9 yards per carry on OSU on the ground, 5th, and 97.3 rushing yards per game, which is 6th. Teams only average 9.7 yards per completion on the Buckeyes, 3rd, and 5.8 opponent yards per pass attempt on them, 7th. They have an elite defense, Ohio State does, and they have receivers like Jeremiah Smith, for example, who is an All-American. Emeka Egbuka, I think, is also close to being an All-American. Carnell Tate is a future star. And their safeties, when you look at it, Caleb Downs, Lathan Ransom, the nickelback position is occupied by Jordan Hancock, who is a player that I very much like. They're impressive. They tackle well, they hit hard, they do a good job of reading the defense and also defending the pass. Jeremiah Smith on the season has 934 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, and 57 receptions. He's a big part of the reason why Will Howard has been an upgrade overall compared to quarterback Kyle McCord, who's at Syracuse now after transferring away from Ohio State after the conclusion of the 2023 regular season. Some weaknesses for these teams. For Tennessee, it's the quarterback position. It's Nico Imaliava, having a good year, but not a great year, not playing up to the expectations that many, including myself, had from him in the preseason. It's a Tennessee offensive line that is anywhere from above average to good in both pass protection and also run blocking, but not great in either of those. And overall, it's a pass offense that has just been off kilter. You see moments where, like Dante Thornton's averaging over 20 yards per reception, where they can be explosive and they can really punish defenses deep or in the passing game in general. But there are also moments where it's just totally dysfunctional. There are drops. Imaliava overthrows someone, doesn't make the right decision. Tennessee is just their weaknesses are more about inconsistency than about talent, which is both encouraging as they have a long time to prepare, and Heupel is a good coach. For a game like this, it can be encouraging. It can also be discouraging because this is the best defense that Tennessee has played all season long, also the best secondary. Georgia's secondary has had some holes. They have been vulnerable. We've seen it against Texas. We've seen it against Alabama. We have seen it against Georgia Tech. And we also saw it against Tennessee at times. Ohio State's secondary is, I wouldn't say exactly the same. It's not that much better than Georgia's by a wide margin, but it is better. And add on top of that Ohio State has the better rushing defense. Well, Tennessee has their work cut out for them, and they're playing on the road in a much different climate, in a colder climate, in a hostile environment with over 100,000 people who are going to be, very angry fans. Ohio State has a sack percentage of 10.51%, which is second. So they get to the opposing quarterbacks in over 10% of their dropbacks. Tennessee, they allow 2.2 sacks per game, which is 74th. And they have a QB sack percentage of 7.45%, which is 91st. So that is not an encouraging matchup there. They only average 7.9 yards per pass attempt and 12.5 yards per completion. And again, they run the ball a lot, but they're not even top 25 in yards per carry. And it's a lot like Ohio State, where earlier in the year, Ohio State and Tennessee feasted on the ground, but now after injuries for OSU and for Tennessee, after they've played some tougher competition, it's a little bit of the same for Ohio State as well. They've really began to be exposed in the fact that their rushing offense, it can be good. It does have some spark, but it's also not a perfect unit by any stretch of the imagination. Nico Imaliava is going to have a great game here. Same with Brew McCoy, Chris Brazzell II, Squirrel White, Dante Thornton. They're going to have a great game. And this offensive line with players like Lance Hurd, Andrej Karic, Cooper Mays, who's a finalist for the Remington Trophy, I believe, for the best center in the country, along with Seth McLaughlin, despite his injury. And good for him. He's been an elite center this year before his tragic injury. They're going to have to step up. This Tennessee offensive line, their wide receiver core, and their quarterback room. You look at Ohio State, their weakness is their offensive line as well. It's slowly but surely been falling apart because their starting five was near elite, if not elite, but their depth was horrific, and we identified that in the preseason, and all it was going to take was an injury to really make the whole thing disheveled, and indeed it did. And then the second injury was, I think, the final straw that broke the camel's back, especially in regards to pass protection. The run blocking before McLaughlin got hurt was questionable, but it was manageable. But after he got hurt, the pass rush on the interior was that much worse for Will Howard, and the rushing offense was a little bit worse, too, than it already was. And that really slowly has made Ohio State's offense more and more one-dimensional. Ryan Day talked about how they were experimenting and theorizing about different offensive line combinations. I think that's a good idea. I think that the extra time off can maybe help the offensive line because at one point in the year, they were first in QB sack percentage. They're 18th, and they've been falling further and further down the list in basically every game. And they're outside the top 50 in rushing offense, only averaging 169.3 yards per game. They're 94th in rushing attempts. They don't run the football as much as they used to, obviously because of the injuries. And at one point, they were, I think, maybe even number 1 in yards per carry. They're down to 26th, only averaging 5 yards per carry. Their rushing offense as a whole is a weakness, and it does not help their passing offense either, as they built this team to run the ball to sort of make the passing offense more explosive, not pass the football a lot and run the football occasionally to keep the defense honest. The critical matchup in this game, and we'll talk about another one in a few seconds, is Tennessee's Tim Banks and his defensive line linebackers and safeties against Ohio State's Chip Kelly and the offensive line and the running backs. I say this because whether it's the cold weather or more importantly the fact that I think Ohio State has built this scheme to run the football at times, how does a struggling rushing offense do against a rushing defense that is a near elite unit, perhaps an elite unit? Can Tennessee do what Michigan did, what Nebraska did, what Penn State was able to do at times, and what Oregon, I think, was able to do in the second half, but Ohio State adapted in spite of that and still scored on Oregon? Can they make Ohio State one-dimensional? Because if Chip Kelly, changes up the scheme a little bit, tries different blocking concepts, I think Ohio State had a lot better success with like pull blocking and more complex run concepts, and also speed options and misdirections compared to just straight up pounding up the middle. And they do a successful job passing, and their defense operates like it has all season long. The game can get out of hand for Tennessee. But if Tennessee can do what many other teams have done and make Ohio State's offense one-dimensional, it'll be harder on Jeremiah Smith, harder on Will Howard, and that will give their offense time to maybe figure out this Ohio State defense a bit. And it's going to be hard to figure out this Ohio State defense because Jim Knowles is one of the best schemers in all of college football. He's one of the best defensive coordinators, and he has a lot of talent there. But Ohio State is going to want to run the football, whether it's speed options, whether it's misdirections, whether they decide to run up the middle. And it's all about the offensive line for Ohio State and the running backs. And whether or not their current O-line, Carson Hinsman, Tegra Shabola, Josh Fryer, Austin Saraveld and Donovan Jackson, or if the rotation's different, how do they and Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins do against, James Pierce Jr., Bryson Eason, Amari Thomas, Omar Norman Lott, Dominic Bailey, and then Will Brooks, Andre Turrentine, Jeremiah Tillander, and Arian Carter. That's a fascinating matchup. And then you look here at, I think, what is Tennessee's passing defense specifically against Ohio State's passing offense. I didn't include any matchup that featured Tennessee's offense against Ohio State's defense because I am going to tell you here and now, I think that if this is going to be a high-scoring affair that translates to an Ohio State win, perhaps a dominant Ohio State win. This Tennessee team against, I mean, frankly, like some of the best teams they played all year, like Florida, when Florida had DJ Lagway, and before Graham Mertz was like totally out for the year, they struggled against them offensively. They struggled against Georgia offensively. They struggled against Alabama offensively. Alabama shut them out in the first half. Against this defense, Tennessee is not going to be scoring 40 points. They're probably not even going to be scoring 30 points. How Tennessee wins this game is 24-17. It's 20-13. It is a low-scoring affair. And they will need to get pressure on Will Howard and make him uncomfortable. They will need to cover these receivers well. I mean, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, Brandon Inniss, they're going to get open at some point, but maybe you limit them. You play bend but don't break. You force them to get into the red zone where Ohio State used to be elite, and now they're kind of mediocre because of their one-dimensionality, and you make them work. You make them work in the red zone. You limit explosive plays. And in pass blocking, you do what you can do. You line up James Pierce Jr. wherever he is the most advantageous, wherever he has the most leverage, and you send him at Will Howard. If Tennessee can stop Ohio State's rushing offense and make them one-dimensional, that is not enough to guarantee a win, because what Ohio State can do is what they did against Oregon, where, okay, we can't run the football on you, we'll just pass, and it will still be a game. And Tennessee does not have the offense Oregon does, or the home field advantage to give them the energy to just, respond with offensive body blow after offensive body blow. Tennessee can't win in a shootout here. Ohio State can. Both of these teams can win in a low-scoring, gritty affair, but I think mentally and also stylistically, a low-scoring, gritty affair can absolutely benefit Tennessee more than Ohio State. So those are the key matchups. I'm very excited for this game. It's going to be a night game. Ohio State's first night game of the year against an actual decent opponent, not Western Michigan, so I know that place will be buzzing. And that right there are the early previews, and we're just going to spend anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes more talking about some other topics, and then I'll get on out of here. Okay, someone says Ohio State just has to run gap blocking scheme instead of zone blocking scheme. Clemson, Armand Hammer, thank you for being a moderator. I appreciate the support. I'm not doing a Clemson versus Texas early preview. I will be doing a preview and prediction video on it, though. These are just early previews, though, like me talking about matchups, strengths and weaknesses. There will be a prediction video for Clemson versus Texas, but it's the only game with a double-digit point spread, and we're mainly a Big Ten channel on here. Matchup doesn't feature a Big Ten team or a team that I've engaged with a lot before, so I'm just going to leave that matchup to other channels to do early previews on. But there will be a brief preview and prediction video on that. That's probably, 10 to 15 minutes. OSU has good receivers when they decide to actually throw to them. Yeah. Another concern for OSU is defensive penalties, specifically Burke and Igbinosun. Yes, that is a concern, but that's if Nico decides to throw the ball accurately, which has not been a guarantee this season. If Tennessee can get to Howard and pass rush and slow the game via the run, they have a good chance of pulling off the upset. Bingo. That's what we just talked about. This game completely hinges on Tennessee's defense. If any part of Tennessee's defense fails, the game's over, basically. It's a matchup where, look, and maybe this will give away my prediction, but I don't think it will, because I do think that Tennessee is going to be competitive. They're one of the best opponents Ohio State's played all season long. I mean, Tennessee is they're better than at least 9 out of the 3 opponents Ohio State's played, and they're more talented than Indiana. So, yeah, I don't think they're as good as Oregon, and I don't think they're as good as Penn State, but that does not guarantee a victory for OSU, who has gotten worse as the season has gone on. Like, Ohio State's worse than they were against Oregon. They are an inferior team compared to what they trotted out there against Penn State. They've gotten worse as the season's gone on. So, all I'm trying to say is that when I look, how do I say this? When I observe these teams and the matchup presented to them, I just think that I don't really see a path for Tennessee to score points, like a ton of points. I don't see 30. I don't see 40. I don't, because the only team that's past that against OSU is Oregon. And Oregon is a quarterback who is second in QBR. I don't even believe Nico Imaliava is top 20. And Tennessee's offensive line is not good in pass protection. And they're playing against an Ohio State defense who is more than willing to send the Ohio State's D-line might actually get pressure on Tennessee with 4. If that happens, Tennessee is not scoring more than low 20s or even high teens at the best. They have to win this game by shutting down Ohio State's offense, which is possible. Michigan did it. Nebraska did it. Penn State practically did that too. They held OSU to 20 points. And if not for some stupid penalties, if they were more disciplined, they probably could have held them to 13 or 16, if I'm being honest. And I mean, that's what it is right there. Limit the ground, force Ohio State to be one-dimensional, or maybe what you do is you do what Wink Martindale did against Chip Kelly, where you only put 4 in the box and you lure Ohio State into running the football a lot because they think they have a numbers advantage, and you just stalwart them up front and force them to waste away with plays. I think that's the path for Tennessee to win there. And it's very possible. It's a game that I'm very fascinated by because out of all the games, this one definitely has the most heat to them. I mean, this game, I think, is underrated in terms of the potential for Tennessee or Ohio State to dominate the other team. And I'll leave that at that. But up next, what I want to talk about briefly for, I would say, probably 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most, I think that Bill Belichick at North Carolina would be a brilliant move. And I want to express why I think that. It's reported that Bill Belichick, former New England Patriots head coach and 6-time Super Bowl champion, has accepted the North Carolina head coaching position, but he has a caveat. He has laid basically his own football strategy Bible on the desk of the North Carolina Board of Trustees, and he wants guaranteed investment, he wants control, he wants dedication to football. And I think that North Carolina making that move and transitioning, maybe not to being a total football school because they have a good basketball program, but investing a lot more in football and becoming more of a football school than they've ever been would be a wise idea. It'd be a very smart idea. And the reason I say that has less to do with North Carolina. It has a lot to do with North Carolina. You know, they have recruiting advantages. They have resources. It's a good school with a good alumni base. They're well positioned. It's also in regards to the fact that, you know, Josh Pate has talked about this for years. He's ranted about this, in fact, for years. The ACC is a weak conference. My dad doesn't call it the all-cupcake conference for nothing, and others call it that too. I have called the ACC that before. The all-Charmin conference. It's not good. The ACC is very boring. It's very entertaining if you just watch football and want to watch it like I do. I watched Boston College and Louisville closely, for example. Pittsburgh and SMU. Pittsburgh and Clemson was a very entertaining game. By boring, I don't mean in terms of entertainment. I mean in the sense that you know for the most part when an ACC team gets to the postseason, they're not going to do anything against the SEC or the Big Ten. You had Clemson, who, you know, in 2016, 2015, 17, really 2015 to 2019, 2020, was competitive in the postseason, was a national walking behemoth in power, but they've fallen off ever since 2021. Florida State in 2023 was a competitive team, but they didn't get an opportunity to play for the national title in the postseason. They did have an opportunity to compete with an SEC Big Ten team in the postseason, though. They played Georgia in the Orange Bowl. Their players opted out. Some of Georgia's did, but Georgia kept their roster a lot more intact. I think part of that showed the stronger culture, and they whooped FSU. They destroyed them 63-3. Before that, in 2013, they won it all. 2014, they went to the playoff, the first ever year of the 14 playoff, and got annihilated. Typically, the ACC overall has been a pretty weak conference, but occasionally they've had some national title contenders. Even at one point, more so than the Big Ten. They were a weaker conference than the Big Ten, but their teams at the top were better. That's not the case anymore. Miami is the ACC's best team in terms of power ratings. They're 10-2 and playing in the they're playing literally in the Pop-Tarts Bowl after spending millions of dollars in NIL to get better recruits and go in the portal. They're playing in the Pop-Tarts Bowl against Iowa State. It's just, wow. Now, I don't think Miami's done building their program. I've been of the belief that even in this year where I thought, Miami should make the playoffs, or maybe the season isn't a complete failure, but it's certainly not a success. It's kind of that uncomfortable limbo if they don't make the playoff, that they still weren't done building their program yet. It was year 3 under Cristobal. Their recruiting is still hitting new strides. They're still building their roster. But with the easy schedule they had and with what they were bringing in, you need to do well. And Mario Cristobal, I think, has 2 left feet. I think he can't get out of his own way. James Franklin, at least, beats up on pretty much all the bad or mediocre or good teams he plays as long as they're not top 10 or top 5. Cristobal not only struggles against the top 10, top 5 teams, he can't get out of his own way against teams with inferior talent or smaller teams that may not even be all that good. Georgia Tech, they did not have a healthy Haynes King. They still beat Miami and very much limited that offense of theirs, which is high-flying. Against Syracuse, Miami led 21-0 at one point. They lost 45-38. It's just unbelievable. That is the ACC's best team, Miami, and their best program, I would say right now. Florida State's an absolute disaster at 2-10, and Clemson does not even have a top 25 recruiting class right now, and they're bringing in more 3-stars than blue-chip players. I mean, if Dabo Swinney does not use the portal after this year, Clemson does have a lot of starters with returning, eligibility, so I expect they'll actually possibly be better next year than this year, Clemson will. But in the long term, it does not look good for Clemson. And for Florida State, I think the only reason they didn't fire Mike Norvell was the massive buyout, and I don't like all the coaching hires that he's made, or the fact that it looks like they'll go after Thomas Castellanos in the portal. Gus Malzahn's made those QBs work in his system before, but we'll have to see. There's a massive opportunity here for Bill Belichick if North Carolina invests in him, invests in his staff. He's put together a plan for dedicated roster spending, and some people mocked this. Like I saw people saying, Bill Belichick is just asking North Carolina to do what other schools do already. It's kind of funny that people think this is special. And to a certain degree, yeah. But a lot of those schools that have been doing this are, wait for it, Big Ten, SEC, Florida State, and look what happened to them because they only relied on the portal. I think Ole Miss may even be a similar tale with this, so they didn't have the same type of collapse. Still a failure, though, because they didn't reach the playoffs. And then maybe Miami. There aren't many programs in the ACC who are doing what Belichick is proposing, or at least with the amount of resources that North Carolina has. They have a naturally advantageous recruiting grounds in the Carolinas. They've recruited the DMV heavily before, like Virginia getting good players out of there, Maryland, kind of the central part of the Atlantic coast, those areas. And they have resources. And they've put together good football teams before under Mac Brown, who I did not think was a very good head coach at North Carolina in his second time around. Hopefully he enjoys a good retirement and he's a good person, but I didn't think that with, Sam Howell and the talent they had and how they recruited at points in his tenure, that he was a good game manager or even a good developer, or that he utilized his resources properly. North Carolina has an opportunity to change that. And you look at their schedule in 2025, and I kind of hate this and love it because I don't want college football to end, but it does. Good things have a beginning, and they have an end, and the 2024 season is going to come to a close here in these next 2 months. But you look at North Carolina's 2025 schedule, they host TCU, they play at Charlotte, they host Richmond, they play at UCF, And then in conference, they have road games at California, at NC State, at Syracuse, at Wake Forest, and they host Duke, Stanford, Virginia, and Clemson. It's a very workable schedule. If they put together monstrous resources and get really good portal players, Steve Belichick is probably going to be their defensive coordinator based off of what I've heard, and he has done a great job at Washington, and they get a good offensive coordinator and put together a good staff. I mean, who's to say they can't have immediate success in year one? And then beyond that, if they're willing to invest in football and have a good staff with, returns, like exponential returns or compounding returns, I think it is the term, they can have a lot of success in the ACC. So I think it's a brilliant move. I think it's a big-time hire for North Carolina if they decide to make the commitment, because if they don't give Belichick what he wants, even though they've, they want to hire him, but if they don't give him everything he wants, he won't accept the job. And then that will leave North Carolina, I think, in a very, very tough position moving forward. North Carolina right now is making a decision between going all in on football and potentially being one of the better programs of the next few seasons, perhaps next few decades, because of the investment they'll be making, or basically saying they're exclusively a basketball school until they change their mind. And it may be too late to change their mind with all the conference realignment stuff and the rumors and the speculation that's going on with the changes in college football. So they could run the ACC, North Carolina could, if they make this decision, if they invest in football. I don't think it's a guarantee. I feel like this hire would either be very successful or fall flat on its face. But I happen to think that Belichick is a good coach. He's had a year off. College football is more like the NFL than it ever has been before, especially in 2025 and beyond, with the salary caps where schools can directly pay their players and make deals. I think it's a massive opportunity. I think North Carolina should go all in, and that's my opinion on North Carolina potentially hiring Bill Belichick. And then last but certainly not least, it's good to see the chat's still been active, even though we're talking about the ACC. Someone said I'm late. Well, that's okay. You can, watch. You can watch more of this. Who has more natties, ACC or the Big Ten? In the playoff era, it's actually equal. Both have 2. Michigan last year, Ohio State in 14, and then Clemson for 2 seasons. Overall, I don't know the answer to that. Hey, Chimichanga Guy, thank you for being a moderator on the channel. Maybe Bill can turn it around. I don't know. Nebraska's going to get guys from the portal, and they have Dana Holgorsen. We're actually going to talk about Nebraska here for a few minutes. We're going to talk about the Cornhuskers because, oh my gosh, they promoted John Butler to full-time defensive coordinator. Nebraska did. I don't like that. I really don't like that. But that's a topic for another day. It's something I'll probably talk about on Thursday. Has he ever, just very quickly, because we're kind of in an intermission here, has John Butler ever been a defensive coordinator? Or has he just been a DB coach? I think he may have been a DC at the Bills, actually. Was he? No, he was the defensive coordinator at Penn State in 2013, and that was his sole season. That year, they actually regressed, I believe, on the defensive side of the football. 2013. I don't like that hire. Nebraska's a big-time job, and I feel like that past head coaches, and Rule treated it like a big-time job by hiring Dana Holgorsen midseason. So he's not Scott Frost or Mike Riley and how they treated the job, but it's a big-time job with a lot of resources. I mean, there's nothing else to do in Nebraska sports-wise outside of the Cornhuskers. Like, you have resources, you have an alumni base, you're in the Big Ten. Yeah, the defense in 2013 was 59th, scoring-wise. And the other reason I didn't like it is Nebraska doesn't have a lot in the cupboard on the defensive front. And it's important, especially 2021 Michigan State's the epitome of this. If you have a trash secondary that is worse than most G5 secondaries, but a good defensive front, you will have a successful defense, at least a moderately successful defense in the Big Ten, because the conference does have limitations at quarterback. And I hope you all can still see me, but my stream just froze. So I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to wait to talk about what I have to talk about until Google Chrome stops freezing. I don't know why it froze. It's weird. But yeah, it's an interesting hire. I'll have to look into it more, and maybe I'm wrong in saying that I don't like it, but I mean, Nebraska's just, they're losing so much on that defensive front. And I don't know what they're going to do in the portal. I know that Rule is going to do more in the portal than what he wants to do based off of how they used the portal last season, and also that they're recruiting at a good level, like top third in the Big Ten good, which is impressive and I think shows some long-term success. But I don't exactly know, to be frank. So yeah, okay. This is interesting. I don't like this. Why did it just crash? It's stupid. Why is it doing this? Okay, let me know. I don't know how you're going to let me know, but I'm going to quickly close this out and then I'm just going to open up a new window because I think the stream will still go on until I hit stop streaming. And yeah, after that, we'll be good. We'll be good to resume. So let me go here. I don't know why it crashed. That was annoying. Yeah. Okay, I'm still live. I'm still live, guys, right? All right, all good. Everyone's saying, so we can still see and hear. All right. Yeah, he was a DC at Penn State for 1 year, John Butler was, and it wasn't a very good year. So that was the reason for my initial reaction. Just some thoughts on there. I do think Nebraska should be viewed as a sleeper because Rule in his third year typically pops off. Raiola returns for another season with a much better offensive coordinator. Their offensive line will probably get better with the departures. I imagine Nebraska next year is going to have their best offense that they've seen in a while, since at least the 2021 season, if not before that. But this defense will probably be the worst under Matt Rule's tenure. It'll definitely be worse than, I would say, the 23 unit and probably the 24 unit as well. So let's continue and just for a few minutes talk about some Big Ten college. Let me just stand up a bit. I've been sitting for an hour, which sucks. But let's talk about some Big Ten college football playoff contenders in 2025. The Big Ten regular season is over. The 2020, well, rather, it's a better way to say, the Big Ten 2024 regular season is over. College football, as it is known, it's hard to transition when like everything crashes like that. For many Big Ten football teams, the college football season has already concluded. Yes, many will play in bowl games, although many will also not. But those that are playing in bowl games will probably suffer a lot of opt-outs. The transfer portal is already opened. And with the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams, it's a lot more feasible for many other programs to set the expectation of playoff success, where now if you're Michigan State or if you're Nebraska or if you're Iowa or Wisconsin, your expectations now include reaching the college football playoff when it didn't before, because the field has expanded, because there are more opportunities, because there are more seeds. I mean, the amount of teams that are reaching the playoff this year compared to last year have tripled. So what I want to talk about are 5 Big Ten teams who can contend for a college football playoff berth, some of them potentially a national championship in 2025, but I more so want to focus on just contention for a college football playoff spot in general who didn't make it this season. So Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, and Indiana are excluded. They cannot be on this list because they've made it this season. These are teams who I think, whether it's because their staff is elite or they're making staff upgrades or they have a good roster, they're recruiting well, because of many different factors, maybe their schedule's very easy and workable, at least from a very early 2025 preseason standpoint, or they're returning a lot of players. For a variety of reasons, I think that these teams can contend for a college football playoff berth, some for a national championship in 2025. And of course, all of them are from the Big Ten. That's in the title of the video. Big Ten college football playoff contenders for 2025. Some new college football playoff blood from the Big Ten as it relates to the 12-team college football playoff era, which sadly may be short-lived, or maybe not. Yeah, sadly is the wrong term, because I think that change for the playoff is necessary. But a team that was a contender in the playoffs and for the national championship for 3 years in a row, the Michigan Wolverines had a down year this season. They finished 7-5, 5-4 in the regular season. They beat Ohio State, their only road win and only good win of the season. I was going to say ranked. USC was technically ranked when they beat them, but USC didn't finish the season ranked. So it was really the only successful big win of the season. It was the only win against a top 10, top 5 team in football power, which is what I classify as a big time win. Why can Michigan be a contender in 2025 for the college football playoff? And I'm even going to go a step further and say the national championship. It's because their roster and coaching are improving. They're making better hires in the coaching staff. That's why they fired Kirk Campbell, and they're going to make an upgrade there. Their roster, because of a top 10 recruiting class and because they're committing millions of dollars to the portal, is going to be better. Bryce Underwood can be a key contributor. They're returning some players along the defensive line, like Rayshon Benny, for example. They have some nice players in the secondary. On the offensive line, some good tight ends like Marlon Klein, for example, and some young running backs who I enjoy. And their investment, which feeds all of this, is up. And their schedule for the Michigan Wolverines is also a very workable one. I mean, you look at their non-conference, there is no team like Texas who is a presumed national title contender. Their non-conference schedule is hosting New Mexico, then playing at Oklahoma, which will be tough, but Oklahoma is not expected to be as good as Texas is this season. Oklahoma right now, I'd say, is in a pretty messy spot as a program. You look at Central Michigan, that's Michigan's third non-conference game. It's at home. Their conference schedule is at Maryland, hosting Purdue, hosting Washington, hosting Wisconsin, playing at Michigan State, at Nebraska, at Northwestern, at USC, and of course at the end of the year they host Ohio State. And all the dates of the games except the Ohio State game are not known. Those will actually be dropping tomorrow, but those are their conference games. A much more workable schedule than last year. They don't play Oregon, they don't play Penn State. Games like at Nebraska, at USC, and at Michigan State can be tough. Ohio State is going to be a good team. Of course, on the road at Oklahoma in the non-conference early in the year when it's hot down there could be a mess, especially since Oklahoma's making their own staff and roster upgrades potentially. But this schedule has a lot of opportunity attached to it. So I think that Michigan can be a college football playoff contender, and with the amount of talent and the upside of said talent and coaching upgrades they're bringing in, they could even be a national championship contender next year. But a lot of that's to be determined. I still wouldn't view Michigan as a better team entering next year than like Penn State, where I almost said them earlier because I was thinking ahead, or Ohio State or Oregon, for example. Need to prove some things. It's similar with USC in the sense that they do need to prove some things, and when I say that they're a college football playoff contender next year, and I think even a national championship contender next year, that's not me saying they're better than the teams who have made it this season. Like, I wouldn't tag them entering next season as a better team probably than Oregon or Penn State or Ohio State. Indiana's a little bit of a different story, but I still think that Indiana could very well be good because they want to invest in football, and it's clear by their NIL spending and coaching hires. They retained all their coaches except for OC Tino Sansuri, who is staying for Indiana's playoff run. So he's at least showing a lot of ethics there by not leaving the Hoosiers until the playoff run's finished. That's awesome. You look at USC, though. They have an elite staff on defense. They lost Matt Entz to be the head coach at Fresno State, but Eric Henderson's a great D-line coach. I think that D'Anton Lynn's one of the nation's best DCs. Doug Belk, good secondaries coach. And Lincoln Riley is still a great offensive mind. I think he has to do a better job at running the football and be less pass happy. I think they didn't use their rushing offense properly this year, and the Trojan Blade, great YouTube channel, can attest for that. Many USC fans can. I've seen it with my own eyes. But I think their staff overall is elite, and they'll be in year two, which helps a lot because that defense is going to be even better next year than it was this season. And I'm confident they will make upgrades on the lines of scrimmage. They finished off strong with their 2025 recruiting class. I think that USC next season can get it done. That they can do a good job and rebound and have a year that's more like the 2022 year than the 2023 or 2024 season. Their schedule is hosting Missouri State, hosting Georgia Southern, playing at Notre Dame October 18th, and then in conference, the dates to be determined, same with the times, at Illinois, at Nebraska, at Oregon, at Purdue, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, UCLA at home. So a lot of tough road games. And also you got that home trip against Michigan, and some of those other teams could be problematic. But it's still a workable schedule where there isn't an Ohio State, there isn't a Penn State. You have Michigan, but you get them at home. You have Oregon on the road and Notre Dame on the road, but if you make certain moves, you maybe could beat those teams, though for Oregon especially, I'd say that's doubtful. However, a 10-2 USC, would they be denied from the playoffs? I don't know, but I'd probably lean toward no, they wouldn't. So I think they're a college football playoff contender. I think if they make certain moves, like Michigan, they can be a national championship contender in 2025. Illinois, I do not think is a national championship caliber team next season. They certainly aren't this year. But they're a college football playoff contender because their schedule's manageable. They're going to return a lot of their roster. I do believe that you never know in the portal era. And I think that Brett Bielema has shown this year that he's a pretty good head football coach. I mean, look at Illinois' schedule. I'm going to read it off to you. Western Illinois, at Duke, hosting Western Michigan. That road game at Duke can tell a lot about this team, like the game against Kansas and also the game against Nebraska did. And then their conference schedule is Maryland, Northwestern, Ohio State, Rutgers, and USC at home, Indiana, Purdue, Washington, and Wisconsin on the road. There is a chance in all of these games that Illinois is favored in 11 or 10 of them. There's a world where that will happen. Because you look at what they return, and Luke Altmaier has eligibility. You see that, Colin Dixon eligibility, Hank Beatty eligibility, parts of their offensive line and running back room have eligibility. Their defense does, like Aiden Lowry, young player. Obviously, Caden Fagan's going to be back. I like elements of this team. You have a lot of juniors who, could try their hand in the NFL, but also could return for a better season. I mean, think about it. Penn State and Oregon are analytically top 10. In my opinion, they should be higher than that, top 5. I think the analytics are holding some games against them that they shouldn't. And Illinois played both of them. And they played Minnesota, and that was their worst loss of the year. Entering 2025, there may not be a duo of games that are as hard as at Penn State and at Oregon. I don't think there are here. I think the hardest duo will be either Ohio State paired with USC, both at home, or Ohio State paired at Indiana. And that probably won't be as hard as the, two road games against Penn State and Oregon, who might rematch in the national championship duo. So, workable schedule, good staff, good roster that has a lot of eligibility returning, and then you have, I think, again, workable schedule, good roster, good coaching staff, experience. There's a lot to like about Illinois entering 2025, I do believe. And I identified that in the preseason, that this is a young team, which is why I didn't expect them to have a lot of success in 2024, which was a foolish mistake. I picked them to go 5-7. They went 9-3. And now we're entering 2025 here for Illinois, because they're going to play in their bowl game and they'll take their bowl game seriously. I doubt Illinois will have a lot of opt-outs. That South Carolina-Illinois game is a game I'm going to be previewing and I'm excited for. But looking ahead a bit, I think that they have potential to them. Now I want to talk about Nebraska. Why can the Nebraska Cornhuskers contend for a college football playoff spot next year? I don't think that they're national championship contenders. I think Nebraska's a long, long way to go before they're national title contenders. I put emphasis on that because I think we all know that Illinois will perhaps never be a national championship contender. Nebraska has been in the past, and they have a more talented roster by recruiting rankings than Illinois does. And I think you saw that when they played Illinois, where Nebraska had the more talented roster and for a lot of the game looked like the better team, but Illinois was just mentally and physically tougher and had a better game plan, hence why they won. Nebraska loses a lot. They lose some players to the portal, some key players, but they also lose a lot of starters to the NFL. However, Rule is in year 3, and historically, year 3 under Matt Rule has been huge. They upgraded their offensive coordinator big time, from Marcus Satterfield, who's one of the worst offensive coordinators in the country, to Dana Holgorsen, who has historically been one of college football's best offensive minds, and he has head coaching experience. So you basically get like a CEO within a CEO situation, which is very helpful for the offensive side of the ball. Dylan Raiola comes back. Nebraska is going to make moves in the portal. They're recruiting in the top third of the Big Ten. And a common theme in this video has been manageable schedule. It's a very common theme, in fact. You look at Nebraska and the Cornhuskers in the non-conference, they play Cincinnati in a neutral site game, which, I mean, maybe that'll be canceled. I don't know, but I don't think it will be, on Lucas Oil Stadium. Then they host Akron. They host Houston Christian, an FCS team. And then in conference, they play at Maryland, at Minnesota, host Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, USC, and they play at Penn State and at UCLA. That is a schedule that I think is very similar to this season's, which was it wasn't as easy as expected because Indiana and Ohio State are both top 10 teams. But, I mean, let's say that Penn State is probably a top 10 team next year with what they're expected to return and how they recruit, and one of USC or Michigan's a top 10 team. Well, that's, 2 top 10 teams, and the rest are teams that should be beatable. Like, think about it. In 2024, Illinois was beatable, but Nebraska lost. Ohio State, even on the road, 1-score game, Nebraska could have won. It was a winnable game. USC was beatable. Iowa, very beatable. The only games that really weren't winnable were Indiana and UCLA. UCLA should go in the other category. I just forgot to mention them. UCLA was a winnable game. Nebraska just started off very slow in almost a flukish way and nearly came back in the end. So there was an outcome this year, though very, very unlikely. There was an outcome where Nebraska, goes 9-3, 10-2. Statistically, it's probably possible they could have went 11-1, but I'm not going to go there because that's statistics and hypotheticals. But they have a manageable schedule. They've upgraded their offensive staff. I want to see what moves they make in the portal, and also staff-wise, they made some staff moves today that I want to process and look over before I make a prediction on them or before I say they're going to contend for the playoffs for sure. But I think right now they should be in that conversation. And finally, this is more of a dark horse than anything else. We have Michigan State. Why can Michigan State be a college football playoff contender next year? Well, I think it's because their staff is one of the best in the country. I truly believe that Michigan State has an elite staff. And I expect the Spartans to make roster upgrades big time. I already hear that they're in contention for an offensive lineman out of Northwestern who's good. I think Josh Thompson is his name. a cornerback from Alabama, I think another player from Alabama. And the Spartans' schedule, they open up against Western Michigan, host Youngstown State, and then host Boston College. And then conference-wise, they play at Indiana, at Iowa, at USC, at Nebraska, at Minnesota. And they host Maryland, Michigan State, Penn State, and UCLA. It looks to be, well, not an easy schedule, an easier schedule than this year's schedule in 2024, where they played Indiana, top 10, Oregon, top 10, Ohio State, top 10, Boston College on the road in kind of a weird spot, and BC had a lot of, good players, especially earlier in the year, and sort of a weird scheme, like they were able to catch some teams by surprise. And then Michigan State also played Iowa. They beat them, but Iowa power ratings wise is a pretty good team, top 25 team even. So I know that this year was a little bit underwhelming compared to my preseason expectations, and a lot of the blowouts toward the end against Rutgers especially, and also even Indiana especially, rubbed people the wrong way, and understandably so, and the loss to Michigan was bad. But this staff is elite, and I think they're figuring out some things and adapting to what they faced in year one. They're going to have to use the portal heavily again. It's good that they're bringing in their first ever recruiting class of players that they've recruited and scouted. Their strength and conditioning, I still think, is good. They're going to need to bulk up, and by that I mean in terms of depth on the offensive line. And yeah, they're going to need to make some changes, but I think they're going to make those changes roster-wise. I believe in the staff, and they return Aiden Giles. Nick Marsh, it sounds like he's back. They got a lot of key players back. So there's optimism, I think, from my perspective, when I look at the Michigan State Spartans and when I look at Jonathan Smith and his staff. This is the fringiest pick in this video. I think that all the other teams probably have a higher probability of reaching the playoff than the Spartans do next year, but I'm not counting out an elite staff in year two with a more manageable schedule and potential roster upgrades from reaching the playoffs. And that is the end of the live show. It's the end of the video. That's why I'm itching my ear here. It's been bugging me. So thank you guys for coming on. I'm not going to be live tomorrow. Next time we'll be live is on Thursday, probably. Time of that is to be determined. It could be in the afternoon like now, or it could be, later at night, like maybe at 6 or 7. But I'll let you guys know. I am going to get to my studies now, and videos from this show will be uploaded, later today and also tomorrow, and then I'll see you guys Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys very soon.